And if you want to get involved in the SAS somehow, then feel free to contact either myself, Are Olsen at uib.no, or Maria. You have her email address, and we can put you in contact with your country's SAS person. So today we are so lucky to have 3 presentations by Alexandra Jahn and by Suzanne Tank and Claire Gaffey on various aspects of the Arctic Ocean. I think each presentation will take about, how much might that, 20 minutes we're supposed to, and we have room for some questions in between, and we will be done in 2 hours, right? That's yeah. Okay, approximately 2 hours. So I think then I will just give the screen to the first speaker, Alex Jahn from University of Colorado. And Alex, you will talk about projections of an ice-free Arctic Ocean. So please, Alex, go ahead.
Hey, yeah, thank you very much, Ara. Thanks, everyone, for being here, and thanks for the opportunity to present. So I'm going to be talking about projections of an ice-free Arctic Ocean, and that's based on a recent review paper that I published with my co-authors, Mariko Holland and Jennifer Kay, in Nature Reviews on Earth and Environment. And up there is a free-to-read link, which will come up again at the final slide. And yeah, before we talk about future projections, just wanted to kind of quickly look at the observed Arctic sea ice decline, where we can see that over the last couple decades, since we have continuous satellite observations of Arctic sea ice, we've seen a decline in Arctic sea ice in all months of the year, as shown here, going from the darker blue colors several decades ago to the kind of light yellow, light green colors in the more recent decades. And we can see the same picture in all months of the year, where we see less sea ice in more recent years than in the 70s and 80s and 90s. But we've seen the largest decrease in Arctic sea ice cover in terms of aerial coverage in September. And that's because September kind of is a seasonal minimum, and so it integrates up the changes that happen throughout the melt and the growth season. If we look at the observed sea ice loss since 1979, since the beginning of the continuous satellite record of Arctic sea ice, we can see a very clear downward trend, but also a lot of year-to-year variability that's been superimposed on it. If we focus on just how much sea ice we've lost about 3.5 million square kilometers, almost half of the sea ice in September that used to be there at the seasonal minimum in the Arctic. And if we put that into context, 3.5 million square kilometers equal to the red colored area in terms of the United States of America. So a huge area that used to be sea ice covered in the Arctic and no longer is sea ice covered. Generally, in terms of future projected sea ice loss, all models in the most recent iteration of the Climate Model into Comparison project for the IPCC agree that if the CO2 in the atmosphere and as a result the global temperatures continue to increase, sea ice will continue to decrease under all the emission scenarios that are typically being considered for the IPCC. And they will all continue to decrease until about mid-century, and only then do we start to see real big impacts from the different emission scenarios. Sea ice is different than several other variables in the climate system in that sea ice eventually, in terms of its coverage, reaches zero, so it's a zero-bound variable, so it can't just continue to decrease. So eventually we reach what we call ice-free conditions, or as shown here, practically ice-free conditions at 1 million square kilometers. So what is this ice-free Arctic Ocean? So that's exactly when we reach the threshold of practically ice-free conditions, and that's what the Arctic looks like when there's only 1 million square kilometer of sea ice remaining, compared to the currently still about 4 million square kilometers. At that point, this ice is always located in this region here, also called the last sea ice refuge area, where the thickest ice is found, and the ice mechanically accumulates every year. And so just north of Greenland and the Canadian Arctic archipelago. And so that's what's usually referred to as ice-free. In most papers, the IPCC actually called it practically ice-free, which is more accurate because we still have some ice, but we tend to refer to that as ice-free because the central Arctic Ocean is completely ice-free once we reach 1 million square kilometers. Reaching an ice-free Arctic Ocean is a very visual example of anthropogenic climate change. It's not just something that we can see in the statistics of the occurrence of certain events, but it's a very visual example of the climate change impacts because at that point we have completed the transition from a white summer Arctic to a blue summer Arctic. So at the beginning of the satellite record, the Arctic Ocean, even in the summertime at the minimum in September, used to still be covered primarily, largely by sea ice. So we had a white Arctic year-round, so perennial sea ice cover with lots of thick multi-year ice. And we're about halfway through this transition to where it's a practically ice-free Arctic, where we only have about half as much sea ice in the summertime and much less multi-year sea ice. And once we reach an ice-free Arctic, we've completed this transition from a white summer Arctic to a blue summer Arctic. This 1 million square kilometers threshold has been applied to the two different measures of how we measure how much sea ice there is in the Arctic, called sea ice extent and sea ice area. Sea ice area is just what you would expect it to be, the area of sea ice in the Arctic. Sea ice extent is a kind of special variable of how we measure sea ice, in that it looks at whether a grid cell is covered by more than 15% of sea ice, and then it binarily assigns, if it's sea ice extent, the whole grid cell is counted as sea ice covered. And if it's less than 15% or no ice at all, then the whole grid cell is assumed to be ice-free. And so it's one kind of way to think about that is by sea ice area. Like if we look at the Swiss cheese slice, we actually count the area of cheese, whereas for ice extent, we ignore the holes. We just look at the total, all the grid cells that have sea ice. And so sea ice extent is bigger than sea ice area. Why was the sea ice extent introduced instead of just using sea ice area? That has to do with how we observe Arctic sea ice from satellite observations. And satellite algorithms have much larger differences or have large differences in sea ice concentrations and hence in sea ice area that's based on these concentrations compared to sea ice extent. Basically, they're really good at determining whether there is sea ice or there isn't sea ice, but they disagree exactly if there's 80% or 85 or 40 or 45. And so we have much bigger disagreement. These are all different satellite algorithms measuring the exact same conditions in the Arctic. For sea ice extent, we get much better agreement. And so that's how sea ice extent came around. However, it's very dependent on the grid size that is being used. And so sea ice area in terms of models is a much more preferred way to look at it. But in terms of observations, there's definitely benefits to looking at sea ice extent. And so both have been used in studies of looking at an ice-free Arctic. However, that has quite an impact on the projected ice-free years. So if we look at one example from one climate model, the sea ice extent first reaches ice-free condition in 2038. Whereas if we look at sea ice area from the same model simulation, that already reaches first ice-free conditions in 2029. So about a decade earlier than based on sea ice extent. And so different studies, whether they use sea ice extent or sea ice area, arrive at different times of when ice-free conditions are occurring, with sea ice area projection based, usually coming up with earlier, or always coming up with earlier ice-free dates, usually by about a decade. And so it's really important to kind of pay attention to what exactly is the metric that is being predicted. And I'll come back to that. in later, but in the following, we will be using CS area for all the projections of ice free, so the earlier date, and we will also focus on when first ice free conditions are expected, looking at the earliest member from the CMIP6 models that have more than one member available. And that is really important because prior work has shown that there is a large internal variability uncertainty in projections of an ice-free Arctic. And so that goes back to a paper in 2016, where we looked at the impact of internal variability on predictions of an ice-free Arctic, just based on one large ensemble that was available at the time. And we found that there is a 21-year uncertainty just due to internal climate variability on when the first ice-free Arctic happens in this model. And we recently revisited that in a bunch of different CMIP5 and CMIP6 generation large ensembles. And we can see that the CSM1 is very not an outlier at all. It agrees very well with several models that it's about 20 years, but there's also some models that suggest that it's 30 years to 40 years internal variability uncertainty. And so when we have more than one model output from these CMIP models, they can have a very big impact of internal variability uncertainty. And so it's important which member we pick. So a middle one, an early one, a late one. And because we don't want to be surprised by ice-free conditions happening earlier than expected, here we looked at the earliest possible one. Yeah, so internal variability introduces 20-year uncertainty into the prediction of an ice-free Arctic. And the other thing that means is that the first occurrence of an ice-free Arctic is not going to be predictable unless we can predict this internal variability, which we currently cannot, because it's dominated by internal variability. And so once an ice-free Arctic is within the reach of internal variability, which is about 2 million square kilometer maximum within 1 year, an ice-free Arctic can occur just due to internal variability. If we now turn to the first projections of an ice-free Arctic, when do we expect to see them? And the first time we looked at that in CMIP6 was in the CS model into comparison project 2020 community paper. We looked at selected CMIP6 models, which were about half the models that were submitted at the time. And we focused on those selected models that did reasonably well in terms of the historical simulation of sea ice. We found that the occurrence of the first ice-free Arctic is primarily determined by internal variability, not scenario differences. And so we can see that here. We don't see that the highest emission scenario has the earliest ice-free Arctic, and then it gets later and later, but they all happen under all the different scenarios equally early, and that's because they start to happen well before 2040, when we're starting to really see the impact of the different scenarios in the Arctic, as well as this large internal variability uncertainty that can bring about an ice-free Arctic once we're close enough, and we're getting close in terms of where we already are today. We're kind of at 3 million square kilometer within the reach of reaching ice-free conditions. If we look at that in terms of the first, first ice-free conditions in terms of global mean temperature, here looking at the global mean temperature in the 5-year running mean average, we can see that first ice-free conditions begin to occur in these selected CMIP6 models at over 1.5 degree of global warming in the 5-year mean. And only if warming stays below 1.5 degree in the 5-year mean do ice-free conditions stay below 20% probability, where they're possible but still unlikely. And that agrees with earlier work that we did on looking at the probability of ice-free conditions under the IPCC target of staying below 1.5 degree warming, where staying below 1.5 degree was the only way to avoid ice-free conditions. Once we get to 2 degrees, ice-free conditions occur in all ensemble members, and that's seen here as well. So ice-free conditions are likely over 66% probability in the 5-year running mean when global mean warming reaches 2 degrees. And that happens in all of the And then ice-free conditions are very likely to occur for global warming above 2.2 degrees warming. If we look at that in terms of time, when does that happen? Then early ice-free conditions are as likely as not to occur in the late 2020s or 2030s based on the selected CMIP6 models, and that's under all the CMIP6 scenarios. First ice-free conditions are likely to occur by mid-century, again, under all CMIP6 scenarios. So far, all projections had been based on monthly data. So the first time monthly mean conditions in the Arctic reach ice-free conditions. However, now that ice-free conditions are no longer just a remote possibility, but are something that is likely to occur before mid-century, we're thinking about the first time that we're actually going to see ice-free conditions in satellite observations is going to be in the daily data. And so we looked at that in the daily data from one model and found that in 56% of the members, daily ice-free conditions occur at least 1 year earlier than the monthly mean ice-free conditions. And in 20% of the members, they have an offset of 10 years or more. So daily ice-free conditions occurring 10 years or more earlier than in the monthly mean ice-free conditions. And so I think that's important to think about in terms of setting realistic expectations of when we might see ice-free conditions for the first time. And that also made us think about how will we actually decide that we have reached ice-free conditions. Again, that's something that is important to think about now before it happens so that we can send a unified message when it occurs, because it is such a visual example of anthropogenic climate change. There's always a lot of interest in the public domain for projections of an ice-free Arctic, but undoubtedly also when that will happen for the first time. And if we think about that now, we can also refine our projections of the actual satellite observations that we're expecting. And that's important because, again, CS ice-free Arctic has been predicted based on CS area, which will occur earlier, or CS extend, which happens later, with CS extend, again, having a smaller uncertainty in terms of satellite observations. So we need to decide that as a community, what are we actually going to consider ice-free? Which satellite algorithms are we going to base it on? Because again, as I showed you earlier, there's big uncertainties, especially if we look at area up to 1 million square kilometer in September. And then also, will we actually only say the Arctic is ice-free once we have the first months of ice-free conditions, or once we have a day of below 1 million square kilometers sea ice in the Arctic? And so I think that's something that as a community, we really should think about in the next couple of years and come to some agreement. And again, we can also refine our projections once we know exactly what we're going to consider an ice-free Arctic. So far emissions, first ice-free conditions occur at the same time, independent of emission scenarios, but future emissions have a big impact on the Arctic of the future, and for example, on how frequently ice-free conditions occur. And so we can see that here, where we can see a clear scenario impact in the second half of the 21st century on the probability of ice-free conditions in a given year. And the higher the emissions, the higher the probability of ice-free conditions in September. And if global temperatures decrease again, as is assumed under the SSP 119, due to carbon capture, reducing the atmospheric CO2 concentrations, and so bringing global temperatures down again. We also see that Arctic sea ice responds very quickly to that, and so the probability of ice-free conditions decreases under that scenario. The other part where emission scenarios have a big impact on Arctic sea ice is the length of the ice-free season. So far we just focused on first ice-free conditions in September, because that's where they occur for the first time, but they're by no means limited to September. So here we're seeing the probability of ice-free conditions in a given year. So like this last figure, but now for all months of the year, and we can see a very big scenario impact. From the lowest emission scenario to the highest emission scenario of how likely and for how many months the Arctic might be ice-free. By the end of the century, under the lowest emission scenario, with ice-free conditions again being very unlikely in September and potentially August, to likely ice-free conditions in September so almost every year, occurring with a couple of years potentially missed under SSP 126, with the additional possibility of ice-free conditions occurring in August and October, to 3 months of ice-free conditions that are virtually certain under SSP 245, which is the scenario we're basically on track on right now. And under the SSP 585, a potential for ice-free conditions for 5 months of the year that are virtually certain, and an additional months that is very likely. So 6 months of ice-free conditions almost every year under SSP 585. So half the year would be ice-free, with even additional months that are possible. And so really big scenario impact in terms of how frequently and for how many months a year ice-free conditions will occur. And we also see that very clearly if we just look at the sea ice concentrations in the last decade of the 21st century under the different emission scenarios, from the weakest emission scenario to the highest emission scenario, where we under SSP 119 are back to a largely white Arctic throughout the year, where we have again multi-year sea ice that is able to survive the summertime, to a blue Arctic for more than 5 months of the year under SSP 585, and then intermediate conditions with ice-free conditions for 1 or 2 or 3 months of the year. So really big impact of future emission choices on what kind of Arctic we're going to look at in the second part of the 21st century. And so to summarize, practically ice-free conditions of less than 1 million square kilometer of sea ice area are predicted to occur under all emission scenarios. The first ice-free Arctic will occur due to internal variability, and we cannot predict the exact year or even decade of first ice-free conditions, but we can only make probabilistic predictions. The probability of ice-free conditions occurring stays below 20% only if the warming can be limited to 1.5 degrees globally. First monthly mean ice-free conditions are as likely as not as early as the late 2020s or 2030s, and are likely to occur by mid-century. And daily ice-free conditions may occur over a decade earlier than monthly mean ice-free conditions. Future greenhouse gas emissions will determine how frequently ice-free conditions will occur and for how many months a year they may occur. There's a big difference in what the late 21st century Arctic sea ice will look like. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Alex, for this very nice presentation of this very interesting work. And you can also see in the slide from Alex, this is access link to the paper, QR code. So we take some questions. We have time for that. So please raise your hands if you have questions. I can start maybe then with a question, Alex. So given what we know about internal variability in the Arctic, would you think we would know like a few years in advance? Wouldn't our predictions then of what will happen in the coming years improve? So we can know maybe 4 years in advance that we will have a ice-free Arctic Ocean, or do you think that's the case or not?
Yeah, I mean, currently we're not at the place where we can predict that. So if we kind of look at examples from climate models, where we can see that we have very different trajectories of how we reach ice-free conditions, and we can see that there's a lot of internal variability. And currently we can't really predict that what leads to these years where it's very large losses, like as we're seeing here, where we go from kind of present day conditions to nearly ice-free conditions within a span of 5 years, or if we're kind of more on track for a different scenario. But there's definitely a lot of work ongoing on looking at that to try and better be able to predict that. And there's some indication that we can use some of these modes, like the longer term modes of variability, like the IPO, for example, where there's been some work that suggests based on that, we can potentially predict that. And actually one of my students worked on that. He just graduated, and we found that based on the current IPO phase in all the large ensemble models, in agreement with the prior work from Screen and Desser from a couple of years ago, that would suggest that we're on track for an earlier ice-free Arctic based on the current negative phase of the IPO. But that's again just like a chance for that. We can't really deterministically predict that. A hope would be that seasonal sea ice predictions that have some scale up to 2 years out might be able to predict that, to predict when that we might reach an ice-free Arctic next year. But in terms of 4 years, I don't think we're quite there yet. Right now, we can again just say, based on the IPO's phase, it's based on the climate models, it looks like we're on track for an earlier rather than a later ice-free Arctic in terms of this distribution of internal variability of 20, 30 years.
Yeah, okay, good to know. Thank you for that. I don't see any hands. So then we move on. Thank you, Alex, for getting up early in the morning and delivering this presentation. And we have another early bird here for the next presentation, Suzanne Tank from University of Alaska. And she will talk about the Great Arctic Rivers Observatory. So Suzanne, please go ahead and share your screen. It's there.
Okay, everybody can hear me? Yeah. Okay, and you see this? I'm just getting my pointer.
Looks good and sounds good. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Okay, so yes, just going to minimize here. Yeah, thanks for that very kind introduction and also the invitation to speak to this webinar today. Before I get into it, I'd like to begin actually with a land acknowledgement. So first, I'm speaking to you from Edmonton in Alberta in Canada, Treaty 6 territory, which is a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, and Inuit. But also that I'm going to be presenting about work that has occurred across an incredibly diverse suite of traditional territories, including of the Gwich'in, Yupik, Ninets, Dolgans, Nganazans, Evenks, and Chukchi people. Okay, so I'm speaking to the choir here, but one of the defining characteristics of the Arctic, especially if you happen to be a river person, which I am, I'm not an ocean person, is that its drainage basin, so the watershed for the Arctic Ocean basin as a whole, is dominated by a select number of large rivers, so being shown here, and that a relatively large watershed, again, for the Arctic Ocean basin, by oceanic perspectives, at least drains into what is overall a fairly enclosed ocean basin itself. So this means that by sampling a select number of relatively downriver sites, you can gain a lot of information on the chemical signature of river water that's draining from land to ocean. This compositional signature, of course, has implications for a variety of different oceanic processes that are relevant at the pan-Arctic scale. So here, just as one example, I could have chosen primary production. But in addition, because the chemical composition of river water effectively provides a signature that integrates processes from kind of the landscape over which that water has drained its watershed, we can use that compositional signature to at least help us think about a wide variety of processes and also processes of change that are happening on land. So these might include, just as some examples, permafrost thaw, which, for good reason, many of us spend a lot of time thinking about, but also, for example, changes in things like atmospheric deposition, which can be critical for sulfur and also nitrogen, microbial processing rates that you would expect to change both on land and in water with increasing temperatures, which would also affect chemical signatures, and processes such as shrubbification, which will increase organic matter in soils, but also nutrient uptake on land. So on its face, it seems like a relatively simple approach, right? Collecting samples at the mouths of a discrete suite of large rivers can help provide information that's relevant to a variety of scientific questions that we might ask. But of course, you know, also, as I'm sure everyone listening to this webinar is very well aware, the Arctic is, of course, a complicated place, right? And for a variety of reasons. So, you know, in particular, when we're thinking about chemistry and freshwater chemistry, we certainly need to think about the different jurisdictions that comprise the Arctic Ocean watershed. And in particular, methodological differences that these jurisdictions may have and how they, you know, both collect, but also potentially analyze their samples. And then more generally, the fact that the Arctic overall is a remote place with sampling challenges, particularly, you know, when we're thinking of sampling outside of the open water summer season, which of course we might want to do when we're thinking about river water, if we want to think about kind of the full kind of seasonal perspective of what that chemistry looks like. Overcoming these challenges, you know, I would argue at least requires a thoughtful and fairly purposeful approach that pretty much necessarily includes working closely and collaboratively in a meaningful way with local partners, collecting samples using protocols that are unified across sampling sites, and also ideally having single laboratories that are constituent specific for individual analytes that we might want to analyze. And so it was with this philosophy that the Arctic Great Rivers Observatory Program, first as partners, was born in the early 2000s. First, via collaboration by Bruce Peterson and his scientific colleagues. Bruce was at the Marine Biological Laboratory, the USGS for sampling in Alaska, what is now the Government of the Northwest Territories Water Resources Division for sampling in Canada, and a suite of scholars and their local partners in Russia, including Sasha Zulidov, Sergei Zimov, and Slava Gordiev. And samplings continued with, you know, some interruption, but overall little interruption. Here's our current leadership team until the present day, including collaboration with local partners, including now the Aurora Research Institute in Canada, Yukon River Intertribal Watershed Council in Alaska, and critically a suite of expert labs in the US. And so this program now over the past 20 years has collected, as I've mentioned, you know, mostly without interruptions, 6 or more samples per year. There's been some change in how we have done that. We really focused on capturing the spring freshet in early years. So yeah, so this figure here shows the discharge record for each of the rivers and then sampling points superimposed on that. And then more distributed sampling as we kind of shifted to that as time has gone on. And then across a kind of a suite of analytes, including dissolved organics, carbon concentration, and also composition, a suite of dissolved nutrients, dissolved ions outside of the nutrient suite, so more associated with weathering processes, dissolved isotopes, including water isotopes and stable and radiocarbon isotopes for dissolved organics, and then some particulate constituents, including suspended sediments, but also particulate organic carbon, nitrogen, their isotopes, and more recently, mercury. So, you know, early on, we used these measurements to kind of think about what I would call almost like point in space characterization of land to water flux of key constituents. So for example, this relatively early paper now led by Max Holmes, thinking about dissolved organic carbon and key nutrient flux. So this figure shows kind of seasonality of flux across the 6 rivers. More recently, as we've started to measure mercury, there's an assessment led by Scott Zolkos, thinking about mercury flux from land to water. And then also, but still kind of point in time assessments, work thinking about, for example, composition. So here, just to highlight some work that was led by Megan Benke, who was a PhD student at the time, who looked at particulate organics and in particular used stable and radioisotope concentrations and composition to show that at least, you know, a reasonably large suite of particulate organic matter appeared to be derived from aquatic biomass. And then a wide range of folks, of course, have used this data set to think about effect, including in the ocean. So just kind of highlighting here some collaborative work that was led by Clément Bertham, who worked specifically on the Mackenzie using data to think about the importance of inorganic carbon alkalinity in addition to organic carbon for driving river plume outgassing in the nearshore Arctic Ocean. But then, of course, we're 20 years on now, and so we have this data set, and the obvious question then becomes whether or not we are able to kind of parse this data, I suppose, to see a signal of change. And of course, it's long been understood that discharge over long time spans is increasing at the pan-Arctic scale. So here's a recent assessment that was done by Jim McClellan for the recent State of the Climate assessment in the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society that kind of updates that data, but you can see at kind of a cohesive scale for the Eurasian rivers and the North American rivers, this long-term increase in discharge with, as of course you would expect, lots of interannual variability. The Arctic Grow Group kind of resisted doing this trend analyses for a long time because we, of course, knew that this variability was going to be in place in the chemistry discharge as well. But with 20 years of data, we decided to kind of move forward with that assessment, which resulted in a paper that came out last year in Nature Geoscience. And I put this up here just again to highlight the incredibly kind of collaborative nature that is required when we're working across kind of this diverse suite of sites and over this time span to kind of bring this data set together. So we had this time series of chemistry data coupled with the discharge time series for each of these rivers. I have here kind of a statement that it's a complex data set, and maybe it's not so much complex, but of course we have this kind of suite of analytes, right? And when thinking about doing time series analyses, we really needed to think about a way to do that in a, let's see, in a focus sort of way, I suppose. So one of the ways that we used to kind of focus our analyses was to kind of think about constituent classes, and to do that, we ended up kind of relying on what you can see here as a correlation cluster analysis on the concentration data across the Arctic Grow time span. So each of these data points shows the correlation coefficient for individual kind of couplings of concentrations. And then analyte types are clustered using this cluster analysis so that analytes that are similar to each other are kind of clustering together. So as I move forward, I'll kind of focus on these three constituent classes, which kind of broadly break up into mostly weathering associated ions, so highlighted by alkalinity, a suite of inorganic nutrients, kind of exemplified by nitrate, and then a small suite, kind of given our analysis suite of dissolved organics, of course, exemplified by dissolved organic carbon. If we want to kind of think about trends in this type of data set, we need to use a few different approaches, specifically associated with the fact that we have kind of by necessity, continuous discharge time series. So here kind of shown for the Ob River, and then point concentration measurements because of how we need to sample that vary kind of within years seasonally associated with this variation in discharge. So here exemplified by alkalinity again in the Ob River. So we can kind of think about discharge on an annual time step, right, and use a simple Mann-Kendall trend analysis to think about trends over time. When we're thinking about trends over concentration, we need to take that seasonality into perspective, or into consideration, so we can use something like a seasonal Mann-Kendall that bins by season and then does the trend analysis. And then if we're thinking about total constituent flux, flux, of course, is just the product of concentration times discharge, but because we're dealing with patchy concentration, but continuous discharge, we need a model that kind of brings together concentration and discharge, uses the relationship between the two to calculate flux. To do this, we use the weighted regression on time and discharge Kalman approach, which is a weighted regression that varies in discharge time space to calculate flux. Once we have that flux estimate, we can then use a simple Mann-Kendall on that. And then in addition, another nice approach to use is kind of a flow-weighted approach that basically uses a probability density function of the kind of the discharge, normalizes over that function to remove the effects of interannual variation in discharge. And then kind of because of this approach uses, instead of a Mann-Kendall, a block bootstrap approach to estimate the probability of a trend. So when we do this, I'm just going to flip back here and think about kind of these flux estimates and annual trends in time over flux for these three key constituent classes. We had results that, I mean, when we first kind of sat down to do this analysis, I'll be honest, this was not what we were expecting. So this figure shows on an annual basis across all 6 rivers, trends over time, again, on these 3 constituent classes. So for alkalinity, for dissolved organic carbon, and for nitrate. So you can see, and I've kind of missed my my statistical outputs here, but clear positive increases in alkalinity, no overall trend in dissolved organics, and overall declines, and kind of fairly striking declines in nitrate. Oh, I seem to be frozen. I hope you can still hear me on your end. I'm just going to wait this out.
We can hear you, and you are not frozen.
Here we go. Okay.
Yeah.
It's responding. Okay. And so when we look at this by river perspective, we see fairly similar. So before I get into this, I'm just going to kind of deconvolute this figure for you a little bit. So each of these blocks shows a trend for an individual river for flux for an individual constituent. Positive trends shown in red, negative trends shown in blue, and the depth of color indicates the p-value of the slope, where a very deep color shows a more significant p-value. These values here are just the numerical values of the slope. So for alkalinity, overall, we see these positive trends. Nitrate overall across all rivers, negative, and a bit of a mixed bag, but interestingly kind of river specific for dissolved organic carbon, with variation within rivers that seems overall to be related to differences in discharge, notably over the last 20 years, especially at the Pan-Arctic. The trends in discharge are overall fairly muted. And then when we think about trends in concentration, again, we see kind of using this variety of approaches to think about trends, we see something very similar for alkalinity, nitrate, and very weak trends for dissolved organic carbon. And then when we use that approach to remove the effects of discharge, again, consistent results. So here I'm showing kind of shading, I guess, around boxes for individual rivers for that block bootstrap approach that shows varying levels of significance, but positive trends in blue, negative trends in red. For alkalinity, for nitrate again, and then this very kind of overall a lack of trends, but kind of mixed bag for dissolved organics. And then finally, when we zoom out to kind of take that kind of full suite of constituents that we have and look within these 3 constituent classes, shown here with the gray bars, we see overall kind of consistent trends within these constituent classes, certainly at the Pan-Arctic level, but with some variation that, if you recall back to the discharge slide, appears to be kind of related to what's happening in the discharge. So, as I kind of already alluded to, and this is just the figure that I kind of kicked off the data presentation with, this was for us, I don't think at first blush what we were expecting. And so, I'm a person that works on land. I spend a lot of time within watersheds, looking at features that look like this. So this is a retrogressive thaw slump in the Peel River watershed, which is a tributary to the Mackenzie Delta. This photo here is shown, is taken somewhere around here, right? And it's hard to stand beside a feature like this and see this like incredible mass movement of material and not think that we should expect, you know, broad scale increases and fluxes of all sorts of things from land to water. But in fact, you know, when we zoom out and kind of think about the broad kind of variety of change that's happening on land in the Arctic Ocean, maybe in fact this does make sense. And so here we get a little bit more speculative. But when we think about, you know, some examples of drivers of change, in some cases and for some constituents, so for alkalinity, these appear to be largely acting all in the same direction. So different types of permafrost thaw are pretty universally going to expose a mineral substrate, which increases weathering, which increases alkalinity. Shrubbification and microbial processing on land increases CO2 in soils, which increases acidity, also increases weathering. But when we think about something like dissolved organics, we have kind of varying processes that can happen. So particularly within the freshwater interface, we can get mineral organic interactions, which can actually decrease dissolved organics. And while shrubbification may, you know, increase organic carbon on the landscape, increased microbial processing rates are overall expected to, you know, increase decomposition en route to the mouths of these large Arctic rivers. So just kind of thinking kind of at a broad level, I guess, to close this off, I think kind of these results really, you know, highlight a few kind of important considerations. So first, the real kind of critical importance of process level studies, if you're thinking about riverine outflow, kind of within landscapes to diagnose effect and predict future change. Also, the importance of really thinking about, and in particular, when we're trying to predict forward, the importance of discharge, and for some constituents, at least, possible kind of variable effects that we might see across landscapes. And then, you know, finally, of course, I think what this project highlights is the really critical nature of long-term measurements at the pan-Arctic scale. And, you know, for some measurements, really reinforces kind of the on-the-ground work that is really critical to understanding change. Thanks very much for your attention. And, you know, of course, on behalf of many, this is a project that includes many. This is our project website here. And if anyone would like, they can reach out to me. Here's my email address.
Many thanks, Suzanne. That was deeply impressive. It is an immense logistical effort to get this going. Do we have any questions for Suzanne? Please don't be shy and raise your hands. So I see one hand is up. Lisa, go ahead, please.
Yeah. Hello. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Though my camera's not working. Great. Thank you. Suzanne, thank you so much for this. I've been following your work for years, and it's nice to actually get to see your face and hear you talk. Something that really struck me was early on in your talk when you showed the time series of discharge, the comparison between the Eurasian and the North American rivers. I was really struck by the North American time series that just the last 3 years have all been extremes high. I mean, because this has been sort of the paradigm we've been struggling with for a while, is that the Eurasian rivers are the flow is increasing, but we've not seen that so robustly in the North American rivers. So those last 3 years there, do we have any idea what's going on there? Is that something weird that's happening? Is it just the internal variability, or have we seen a regime shift?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Or can you say?
Yeah, so one point that's worth noting, so this is not directly related to your question, but the time series analysis that I've done ended here, right? And so you might, if as it flashed by, you might have noticed the Mackenzie discharge time series didn't show these really high levels. Yeah, I mean, there's other folks on the team that would be better equipped to answer these discharge questions. I mean, I guess, so I spend a lot of time at the mouth of the Mackenzie River working there.
Right.
And the one thing that we have seen there over the past few years, I mean, it's interesting and kind of paradoxical, are these really almost catastrophic high water levels.
Uh-huh.
That have kind of flooded out communities, been fairly catastrophic for infrastructure, all that sort of thing. But that this is specifically happening during the spring freshet. And then on the Mackenzie, at least during the summer, like late summer season, the hydrograph is relaxing to dry levels that are dry enough that it's causing a problem for shipping, because a lot of stuff comes to these communities along kind of the Mackenzie River. Yeah, so I don't know. Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I don't know if it's a regime shift or not.
Because the Canadian dams aren't being taken down like the American ones are.
Yeah, there's only
so
one
that can't
dam.
explain it.
Yeah, no, there's only one dam on the Mackenzie, and it's on the Peace River. So like upstream of Great Slave Lake, upstream of the Big Lake. So it wouldn't be that. Yeah, and it's in place, but it's covers a very small. So the Mackenzie's technically regulated, but it's really far upstream. It's a really small proportion of the watershed.
Okay, well, thanks. So we don't know. There's weird stuff happening.
Well, yeah, I mean, others may know, but I.
Well, maybe Kimiko knows. You have your hand up, Kimiko.
Yeah, I have more question for Mackenzie. Why alkalinity is decreasing? Why it's different from other rivers?
Well, so that's a good question. And I think this is related to, yes, others have asked that question. I think it's related to, the fact that we had this overall, over the time series, we had this overall kind of decreasing trend in discharge, right? So if you look at the, sorry, I'm flipping through all my slides here. Right, so you are kind of noticing this here, right? But if you look at what happens when you kind of remove that interannual variability associated with discharge, we have this strong positive trend for alkalinity on the Mackenzie, which is in line with what you would expect and in line with other assessments, including other assessments that I've done that have used slightly different timeframes. So I think I think it really points to the importance of understanding discharge for, there's a lot going on there, and constituents can be kind of supply limited or not, right, when they move from land to water, but, discharge really is kind of critical for regulating this flux.
And how you measure alkalinity?
It's by titration.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, I don't see any more hands. I have a question myself. And would you think we have this increase in wildfire frequency and intensity the last couple of years? Will that eventually, would you expect to see some kind of signals from these wildfires in the rivers also?
Yeah, I mean, so it's a very good question. And yeah, wildfire, in Western Canada last summer, it was really quite catastrophic. And also through kind of the northern reaches of the Mackenzie River, Inuvik was almost evacuated. It was a really very striking wildfire season. I mean, I guess so I work a little bit on wildfire and effects on freshwater chemistry. One of the things that strikes me is that results are dependent, they're context dependent, so dependent on the fire itself, how severe it is, right? Because that is going to affect what it does to kind of soils. And then also region specific. So some regions have this kind of apparent strong effect of wildfire, and I think this kind of depends on what the catchment looks like. Others don't. So kind of how that would integrate itself over the watershed. I think, again, is a little bit context dependent, but, you know, some of the stuff we see for wildfire is, for example, increases in nutrient delivery, right? Because you lose the vegetation that is taking up nutrients on land. Changes in organics can be variable. Some certainly increases in particulates you would expect. But how that propagates downstream, I think it depends too in these large rivers where the wildfire is and what the wildfire season looks like.
I guess also it could be quite a long-term effect also, as
Yes.
the vegetation takes
Yes.
quite a bit of
I
time
mean,
to regrow.
wildfires, it's tricky because it's such an important stressor, like the wildfire season in Canada with, like, as I said, just so incredibly catastrophic last summer. But it's so stochastic as well, right? So it makes it very difficult to kind of predict moving forward, I think.
Okay, thank you. Ryan, you have your hand up. Please go ahead.
Hey, great. Thank you. Hey, Suzanne.
Hey,
great
Ryan.
presentation. Good to see you. Hey, I was just wondering, do you guys, I forget if you have or if you have any plans, you guys have any plans to do any kind of monitoring or kind of research on those big thermokarst sites that you guys do have to kind of see the effects downstream and
yeah. So does the Arctic Great Rivers Group have that plan, or
well,
like do others?
Yeah, either them or you or
either or
yeah, or somebody. I know that's very that one in particular is very famous.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I'd say there's folks working on that. I do a little bit of work on that. Like, so certainly like the Peel River watershed, which, you know, on a Pan-Arctic scale is kind of, I guess, a medium-sized watershed, is one that is incredibly affected by these thaw slumps, right? And so that's a place where we have, through kind of Canadian government and territorial monitoring, fairly long-term time series in the Peel River to kind of think about those effects. So yeah, I mean, I'd say that work is ongoing. Again, it's a little bit you know, catchment specific because the disturbance doesn't happen everywhere. And then it kind of depends on, you know, where in the watershed it's happening, whether or not you're going to be able to kind of pick up the effect above and beyond other noise.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I know that like Ben Jones has done some over in Alaska and some other folks have too, but yeah. Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
There, I was muted. I think we move on. Thank you again, Suzanne, for getting up early and presenting this work for us. And the next presenter is